For centuries, the Catholic Church stood as one of the most powerful and respected institutions in the world. It offered hope, guidance, and forgiveness to millions of followers who trusted their priests as moral and spiritual leaders. In communities around the globe, the Church was a symbol of comfort and faith. But beneath that image of holiness and purity, something dark was growing quietly for decades, hidden by silence, protected by secrecy, and ignored by those who should have spoken up. The Catholic Church abuse scandal would become one of the most shocking and devastating revelations in modern history, shaking the faith of millions and exposing how a sacred institution failed the very people it was meant to protect. The roots of the crisis stretch back far earlier than most realize. Cases of priests abusing minors had been reported as far back as the 1950s and 1960s, but they were almost always handled quietly. When victims or their families came forward, church officials often dismissed the claims or moved the accused priests to another parish instead of removing them from ministry. The goal was to avoid public scandal, protect the church's image, and prevent lawsuits. This system of secrecy, what survivors would later call the culture of cover-up, became deeply embedded in the institution's response. In many cases, victims were children who had been taught to trust their priests completely. The abuse often took place in churches, rectories, or schools, places that were supposed to be safe. The children didn't always understand what was happening to them, and when they tried to tell someone, they were often silenced. Families didn't want to believe it. Some were pressured by church leaders to stay quiet for the good of the parish. Others were threatened with excommunication or made to feel that they were sinning by speaking out. For many survivors, the trauma wasn't just physical or emotional, it was spiritual. The person who represented God to them had betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. By the 1980s, isolated stories of sexual abuse by clergy began to surface more publicly in the United States, Canada, and Ireland. In Louisiana, a priest named Gilbert Goff was accused of molesting dozens of boys. When the case became public, it shocked local communities but also revealed a disturbing pattern. Church officials admitted they had known about Goff's behavior years earlier but had simply moved him from one parish to another. The same thing was happening in Boston, Chicago, Dublin, and many other cities. Each time, the church's response was to handle it internally and avoid publicity. Victims were offered hush money, and priests were sent to special treatment centers, only to be reassigned later. The turning point came in the early 2000s. In January 2002, the Boston Globe published the first article in what would become a groundbreaking investigation known as the Spotlight series. Reporters at the paper uncovered a decade. As the first wave of revelations swept through the United States and Europe, the Catholic Church found itself in the middle of a storm it could no longer control. What had started as isolated cases was now seen for what it truly was, a deep, systemic failure that reached into the highest levels of the hierarchy. The Church's initial responses often made things worse. While many bishops and cardinals expressed regret, their apologies rang hollow to victims who had spent decades being ignored or silenced. Words alone could not erase the betrayal or the years of secrecy that allowed abuse to spread unchecked. In the years that followed, countries around the world launched their own investigations into the Church's handling of sexual abuse. In Ireland, the Murphy Report and the Ryan Report revealed a grim picture of institutional abuse spanning decades. Children in church-run schools and orphanages had been subjected to physical and sexual violence, forced labor, and psychological torment. The reports described an environment where cruelty was normalized, and where those who dared to complain were punished even further. The Irish government, under intense pressure from the public, issued a formal apology to the victims. The Church's power in Ireland, once absolute, began to crumble. For generations, Irish society had revolved around Catholic teaching, but after the reports were released, many people turned away from the Church entirely. Germany, too, faced its reckoning. In 2010, reports emerged that priests in several dioceses had abused children and that church leaders had quietly transferred offenders rather than report them. The scandal gained more weight when it was revealed that Pope Benedict XVI, while serving as Archbishop of Munich in the 1980s, had approved the reassignment of a priest known to have abused minors. The revelation shook Catholics around the world. Benedict, who had once led the Vatican office responsible for handling abuse cases, was now facing criticism for his own past decisions. Though he expressed deep sorrow and apologized to victims, the damage to his credibility was significant. The Vatican tried to show that it was taking the issue seriously. New rules were introduced to make it easier to remove abusive priests, and training programs were established to help bishops deal with allegations properly. But many survivors argued that these measures were only surface level. They wanted full accountability, not just from individual priests but from the bishops, cardinals, and Vatican officials who had enabled abuse through cover-ups. Lawsuits continued to mount. Dioceses across the United States, Canada, and Europe declared bankruptcy under the weight of compensation claims. The Church sold properties, closed schools, and merged parishes to pay for settlements. Yet no amount of money could truly heal the loss of innocence or the destruction of faith that so many survivors had endured. In South America, the scandal took on. As the 2020s began, the Catholic Church faced a future shadowed by its past. The abuse scandal was no longer a single story confined to one country, it had become a global reckoning that stretched across continents and generations. From the smallest parish to the Vatican itself, the crisis had forced the Church to confront its darkest truth, that the harm done in the name of faith could never be undone, and that silence had protected sin more than any sinner ever had. By this time, hundreds of priests had been defrocked, thousands of cases had been brought to light, and billions of dollars had been paid in settlements. Yet the sense of betrayal among ordinary Catholics ran much deeper than numbers could show. In towns and cities around the world, churches that had once been centers of community and comfort were now places of painful memory. For many survivors, simply walking past a church could trigger years of buried trauma. For others, their faith remained strong but changed, it was no longer in the institution, but in the God they believed still stood apart from it. Pope Francis tried to keep the Church focused on repentance and reform. In speeches and letters, he condemned the culture of clericalism, the idea that priests and bishops were somehow above accountability. He urged Catholics everywhere to listen to survivors and to see their suffering as the Church's own wound. He also implemented new laws, making it mandatory for clergy to report abuse and ensuring that even bishops could be investigated for cover-ups. The Vatican established offices to handle complaints, introduced safeguarding policies for minors, and created guidelines for transparency. But despite these steps, progress was uneven. In some parts of the world, especially in developing countries, abuse cases were still hidden. The same patterns of denial and protection that had been exposed in the West were being repeated in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Local churches, lacking independent oversight, continued to handle allegations quietly. Many bishops feared that exposing abuse would destroy what little trust remained among their congregations. Others simply refused to believe that such crimes could happen under their authority. The Church's global nature, once a symbol of unity, now made it difficult to enforce consistent accountability. Survivors groups continued to lead the charge for justice. Organizations like SNAP and Ending Clergy Abuse kept pressure on both governments and the Vatican. They demanded not just apologies but real consequences for those who had covered up crimes. Their persistence inspired similar movements in other religions and institutions, from sports organizations to schools. The Catholic Church scandal had opened a door to a broader cultural awakening about power and abuse, showing how institutions could fail when self-protection mattered more than truth. In many countries, civil authorities no longer trusted the Church to investigate its